In the winter of 1913, a 40-year-old psychiatrist sat alone in his study on the shore of Lake Zurich. To the outside world, Carl Gustav Jung had achieved everything a man of his era could hope for. He was the heir apparent to Sigmund Freud, the rising star of the psychoanalytic movement, a man with a beautiful wife, 5 children, and a reputation that stretched across Europe and America. His word association experiments had brought him international fame. His future was assured. But inside that study, something was terribly wrong. Jung heard voices, not the distant murmur of servants or the laughter of his children from downstairs, but voices that seemed to emanate from within the walls, from the furniture, from the very air around him. His house felt haunted. When he wrote, his pen sometimes moved as if guided by another hand. He experienced visions so vivid they left him breathless. Europe, drowning in blood, frozen wastelands littered with corpses, great cities reduced to rubble. He felt a constant pressure, a rumbling beneath the surface of his mind, as if the solid ground of his sanity might crack open at any moment and swallow him whole. To steady himself, this respected psychiatrist, this man who had probed the deepest recesses of the human mind in others, began to play children's games by the lakeshore. He collected stones and built little villages' houses, churches, fortifications, arranging them with painstaking care, as if these miniature structures could anchor him to reality. He feared he was going mad. He feared he was becoming one of the patients he had treated at the Burghölzli asylum. Why would a man at the absolute peak of his powers descend into this chaos? Why would he open the door to such terror? The answer lies in understanding that Carl Jung's entire life had been a preparation for this moment. His theories of the psyche, the shadow, the anima, the collective unconscious, individuation, were not abstract intellectual constructions born in the quiet of a library. They were lived realities, intense personal struggles that he later conceptualized into a system for understanding the human soul. His life's work was, in a very real sense, his autobiography. And to understand the man who emerged from that study, we must first understand the child who learned to live with ghosts. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in the small Swiss village of Keswil. But his psychological story begins in the parsonage at Laufen, where his father, Paul Jung, served as a country pastor. The parsonage was a large, rambling house filled with the silences of a troubled marriage and the heavier silences of religious doubt. Paul Jung was a gentle man, but weak and increasingly disillusioned with his faith. He went through the motions of belief, delivering sermons he no longer felt, ministering to a flock whose simple faith he secretly envied and resented. His son would later describe him as a man trapped by his own dogma, unable to experience the living, breathing mystery of God. Carl's mother, Emily, was a more complex figure. By day, she appeared as a conventional Swiss Hausfrau, plump, practical, somewhat distant. But at night, something else emerged. The young Carl would sometimes see her from his bedroom door, her figure strangely altered, her voice deeper and more authoritative, as if another personality had taken possession of her body. She spoke of things she could not possibly know. She seemed to see into another world. This was the child's first, visceral encounter with the idea that a person is not one thing, but many, that beneath the daylight self lurks something ancient and strange. An only child for the first 9 years of his life, Jung was thrown back upon his own resources. He played alone in the meadows and graveyards surrounding the parsonage. He invented elaborate fantasies. He carved a tiny mannequin from the end of a wooden ruler, dressed it in a little frock coat and top hat, and hid it in the attic. To this secret companion he brought tiny stones he had painted and scrolls inscribed in a language of his own invention. He would visit the mannequin in secret, performing rituals whose meaning he could not explain, but whose power he felt deeply. Looking back on this childhood ritual in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "I know from the first that the little mannequin was a kind of embodiment of my thoughts, and I felt that he belonged to me in some mysterious way. I cannot say what it was that moved me to this act of worship, but I knew that I was doing it because it was right and must remain secret." This was not merely a child's game. It was an early, primitive form of what Jung would later call individuation, the vital human need to give the inner world its due, to create a space where the soul can speak. The mannequin in the attic was a sacred object, a bridge between the ordinary world of the parsonage and the mysterious realm that Jung sensed beneath the surface of things. That realm announced itself most powerfully in a dream he had around the same time, a dream that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He dreamed he was in a meadow beneath the parsonage when he discovered a dark, rectangular hole in the ground, lined with stone. He descended a stone stairway and found himself in an underground chamber. On a golden throne stood something he could only describe as a giant phallus, a cylinder of skin and flesh reaching nearly to the ceiling, with a single eye at the top, gazing upward. It was motionless, but the boy knew it was alive. From somewhere above, he heard his mother's voice float down. "Yes, just look at him. That is the man-eater." A modern reader, steeped in Freudian assumptions, might reach immediately for sexual interpretations. But Jung himself insisted that his childhood self experienced no fear, no sexual arousal, only awe. He woke from this dream with a sense of profound mystery. He knew, with the unshakable certainty of a child who has glimpsed something real, that he had stumbled upon a subterranean god, a primitive power that existed outside the neat theology of his father's church. This was his first encounter with what he would later call the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche that is not personal, not derived from individual experience, but universal, ancient, and charged with symbolic power. This dream crystallized a duality that would define his entire life. He came to think of himself as two distinct persons, which he called personality number 1 and personality number 2. Personality number 1 was the modern Swiss schoolboy of the late 19th century. He had to study mathematics, which he detested. He had to navigate the brutal hierarchies of the playground, to make his way in a world that valued practical achievement and social conformity. He was the son of a poor country pastor, determined to succeed, to make his mark, to escape the poverty and obscurity of his childhood. But personality number 2 was something else entirely. He was an old man, a wise and slightly cynical figure from the 18th century, or perhaps from some even more distant epoch. He lived in a world of myth, of symbol, of meaning. He was the one who had dreamed the phallus dream. He was the one who carved the mannequin and performed the secret rituals. He felt a profound kinship with the ancient world, with the Gnostics, with the alchemists, with all those who had sought the divine, not in churches, but in the depths of their own souls. He knew things that personality number 1 could never learn from books. Jung later wrote, "Through the personality number 2, I was somehow connected with the past, with the centuries long gone. I had the feeling of continuity, of having been before, of being centuries old. Number 2 was outside time." This was not a pathological split. It was a creative tension, a dialectic between two ways of being in the world. Personality number 1 kept him anchored in reality, gave him the drive to study medicine, to build a career, to marry and raise a family. Personality number 2 kept him connected to the depths, to the mystery that his father's sterile faith could not touch. The task of Jung's life would be to hold these two personalities together, to find a way of being that could contain both the modern psychiatrist and the ancient sage. Personality number 1 was determined to succeed. Jung entered the University of Basel in 1895, and after some hesitation, chose medicine. But it was psychiatry that truly claimed him. At the time, psychiatry was the backwater of medicine, the place where ambitious young doctors did not go. But for Jung, it was the perfect fit. The only field that combined his scientific training with his lifelong fascination with the strange, the marginal, the inner world of personality number 2. He took a position at the Burgholzli Asylum in Zurich, working under the great psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, and he was brilliant. He threw himself into the work with an intensity that impressed everyone around him. He developed the word association test, carefully measuring the time it took patients to respond to stimulus words. He discovered that when a word touched a sensitive spot, what he would later call a complex, the patient would hesitate, stumble, or give an unusual response. He demonstrated, with empirical precision, that the unconscious exists and that it has a structure. It was not merely a storage closet for repressed wishes. It was a dynamic system that shaped thought, emotion, and behavior in measurable ways. By his early 30s, Jung was internationally known. His work on word association had made his reputation. He had married Emma Rauschenbach, a wealthy heiress, and built a beautiful home in Küsnacht on the shore of Lake Zurich. He had a thriving private practice. He had constructed a magnificent persona, Dr. Carl Jung, the rising star of European psychiatry, the man who would lead the exploration of the unconscious mind. And then, in 1907, he traveled to Vienna to meet Sigmund Freud. Their first meeting lasted 13 hours. They talked, they analyzed each other's dreams. They discovered a shared passion for plumbing the depths of the human psyche. For Jung, it was the meeting of a lifetime. Here was the father he had never really had, a man of intellectual courage, a man who took the unconscious as seriously as he did. For Freud, Jung was the answer to a prayer, the brilliant young Gentile who would carry psychoanalysis forward, who would rescue it from being dismissed as a Jewish science and establish it as a universal psychology. The emotional intensity of their relationship can hardly be overstated. They wrote long, passionate letters. Freud addressed Jung as his son and heir. Jung called Freud his father and master. They traveled together to America in 1909, analyzing each other's dreams aboard the ship, presenting a united front at Clark University. It was, for a time, one of the great intellectual partnerships in the history of psychology. But the fault line was already there. Remember personality 2. For Freud, the unconscious was ultimately reducible to a single principle: repressed sexuality. Everything from a dream about a phallus to a vision of God could be traced back to the libido, to the primitive drives of the id. But for Jung, whose childhood had been populated by subterranean gods and secret rituals, this felt like a reduction. It felt like an attempt to explain the mystery of the soul in mechanical terms, to flatten the numinous into the merely biological. The break, when it came, was brutal. It culminated in 1912 with the publication of Jung's book, Symbols of Transformation. In it, he analyzed the fantasies of a young American woman named Miss Frank Miller, but he did not reduce them to personal sexuality. Instead, he saw in them echoes of ancient myths, the hero's journey, the solar deities, the universal patterns of human imagination. He saw what he would later call the archetypes of the collective unconscious at work. For Freud, this was heresy. It was abandoning the one true faith. The letters between them became increasingly bitter. Freud fainted in Jung's presence during a heated argument about the role of sexuality in psychology. The father-son dynamic curdled into rivalry and resentment. By 1913, they had severed all contact. For Jung, the loss was devastating. He had not merely lost a mentor, he had been excommunicated from the movement he had helped to build. Former friends and colleagues turned against him. The international reputation he had worked so hard to construct now seemed like a hollow shell. He was isolated, adrift, cut off from the intellectual community that had sustained him. And this is the crucial psychological moment. He could have retreated. He could have tried to repair his persona, to write more cautious books, to rebuild his reputation on safer ground. But that was no longer possible, because by breaking with Freud, he had broken with the dogma that the psyche was a knowable, reducible machine. He had chosen personality number 2. He had chosen the mysterious, the mythological, the unknown, and the unknown was now rising up to meet him with terrifying force. This is where we return to the study on Lake Zurich in the winter of 1913. In the years that followed, Jung entered a period he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. It is, without question, one of the most remarkable psychological experiments ever conducted, an experiment in which the scientist was also the subject. The explorer was also the territory to be explored. It began with a vision. In October of 1913, while traveling by train, Jung was suddenly seized by an image of a monstrous flood engulfing Europe. He saw the civilized world drowning, bodies floating in the wreckage, the ruins of cities jutting from the water. The vision lasted 2 hours. He was sick with terror. He thought he was psychotic. He saw the same vision twice more over the following weeks. And then, in August of 1914, the guns of August rang out. World War I had begun, and Jung realized with a shock that his vision had not been a symptom of personal madness, but a glimpse into the collective psyche of Europe. His unconscious, he realized, was connected to something far larger than his individual life. It was connected to the unconscious of his entire civilization. This realization was both terrifying and validating, but it did not stop the internal onslaught. If anything, it intensified. He felt he was living in a perpetual earthquake. He heard voices. He felt presences in the room with him. His house seemed haunted. He was visited by figures from the depths, an old man with a white beard and the wings of a kingfisher, whom he named Philemon, and a beautiful blind woman named Salome. They spoke to him. They argued with him. They taught him things he had never learned from books. And here is where Jung's genius and courage intersect. Most people, if they began hearing voices and seeing winged old men, would do everything in their power to suppress the experience. They would reach for medication, for distraction, for any means of making it stop. But Jung, the psychiatrist, the scientist, did something different. He decided to engage. He developed a method he would later call active imagination. He would sit quietly, clear his mind, and let the images come. He would not merely observe them passively. He would interact with them. He would ask Philemon questions. He would argue with Salome. He would demand to know what they wanted, what they represented, what they were trying to show him. He would write down these conversations in a series of journals bound in black leather journals he kept secret for decades, which have since been published as the Red Book. They are filled with exquisite, terrifying paintings of his visions, serpents and mandalas, strange godlike figures, cosmic landscapes of immense beauty and terror. To keep himself anchored to reality, he did the most human thing. He played. He remembered the boy who had carved a mannequin and hidden it in the attic. He began building miniature villages by the lakeshore, using stones and mud and blocks, constructing tiny houses and churches and fortifications with painstaking care. It was a way of staying connected to the earth, to the concrete reality of personality number 1, while his mind was being torn apart by personality number 2. He was terrified. He later wrote, "I was frequently so wrought up that I had to do certain yoga exercises in order to hold my emotions in check. But since it was my purpose to know what was going on within myself, I would do the exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to resume my work with the unconscious. As soon as I had the feeling that I was myself again, I would surrender to the images." Think of the balance that required to stand on the edge of psychosis, to peer into the abyss, and to say, "I am going in there, but I am keeping a rope tied to the world." He was mapping his own madness in real time, using his training as a psychiatrist to document what was happening, even as it happened. And out of this chaos, the concepts began to emerge, not as abstract theories, but as living presences he could see and touch and argue with. When he encountered grotesque, threatening figures, when he felt murderous rage and primitive lust rising from within, he was meeting his shadow. It was everything he did not want to be, everything he had suppressed in order to become the successful Dr. Jung. The shadow was not evil in itself, he came to understand, but simply the part of the psyche that had been denied expression. It was the price of civilization, the cost of building a persona. When he was guided through his inner world by feminine figures, first his mother's nocturnal voice, then the blind Salome, then a series of beautiful, wise women, he was meeting his anima. It was the inner feminine principle that connected him to his emotions, to his irrational depths, to life itself. The anima was the bridge between the ego and the unconscious, the guide who could lead him through the labyrinth of his own soul. And when he began, spontaneously, to paint circular, symmetrical images, mandalas, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace and order. He wrote, "I knew that the mandala was the center. It is the path to the center, to individuation." The terrifying journey was not about dissolution. It was about integration. It was about finding the one self that could contain all these warring fragments, personality number 1 and personality number 2, the modern psychiatrist and the ancient sage, the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine. He had not gone mad. He had, with immense courage, navigated his own depths. He emerged from the confrontation around 1918 with the raw materials for his entire life's work. The man who emerged from that abyss was different. He was no longer merely a brilliant psychiatrist. He was a map maker of the soul. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to him, trying to translate his terrifying visions into a language that others could use to navigate their own inner journeys. He did not see his confrontation with the unconscious as a breakdown, but as what one biographer would later call a creative illness. He had been given a gift, a terrifying, back-breaking gift, and his duty was to share it. He built a tower at Bollingen on the upper lake of Zurich. It was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a physical manifestation of the psyche, a place built of stone and silence where personality number 2 could live. He built it without electricity or running water. He cooked on an old stove. He carved stone with his own hands. He added to it over the years, creating 4 distinct towers representing the 4 aspects of the self. At Bollingen, he could be the man he had always known himself to be, the ancient one, the sage, the one who lived outside time. He spent more than a decade studying alchemy. To his contemporaries, this seemed like a bizarre detour for a modern scientist. But Jung saw himself in those dusty old texts. He realized that the alchemists were not merely trying to turn lead into gold. They were projecting their own psychological process onto the chemicals. They were describing in symbolic language the very journey he had just completed. The nigredo, the blackening, the descent into chaos, the albedo, the washing, the purification, the rubedo, the final union of opposites, the philosopher's stone, the self. His life story became the ultimate proof of his concept. The path to wholeness, to becoming who we truly are, requires a courageous engagement with all of ourselves, the light and the dark, the personal and the universal, the modern and the ancient. It requires that we make peace with our personality number 1 and our personality number 2. It requires that we descend into the abyss and find at its center not madness, but meaning. What does this mean for us, nearly a century later? Carl Jung's gift to us is not a doctrine to be believed, but a map to be used. We may not hear voices or see winged old men. We may not build stone towers by lakes, but we all have a shadow we would rather not see. We all have an inner voice anima or animus that we ignore at our peril. We all have moments when the neat structures of our lives crumble, when the ground beneath us gives way, when we feel ourselves falling into an abyss we do not understand. Jung's story offers a radical reframing of those moments. Do not run from the chaos, he would say. Do not reach immediately for the numbing agent, the distraction, the easy answer. Instead, turn and face it. Ask it, what are you trying to show me? What part of myself have I been neglecting? What truth is trying to be born in the darkness? The terrifying descent might just be the beginning of the most important journey you will ever take. The journey toward becoming yourself. Because in the end, Carl Jung's greatest theory was the story of his own life. The map he drew of the human soul was first a map he had to draw to save his own life, and he offered it to us as a guide for our own journeys inward.